I never thought that watching my 8-year-old son get humiliated in a school parking lot would be the beginning of the most incredible week of our lives. But sometimes, when you're drowning in your own struggles, you don't realize that guardian angels come in the most unexpected forms. My name is Sarah Martinez, and this is the story of how my little boy Tommy went from being the target of cruel bullies to having 60 motorcycle riders as his personal escort to school. But let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand just how dark things had gotten before the light broke through. Tommy was 8 years old that autumn of 2023, small for his age with thick glasses that were held together by electrical tape after too many accidents during recess. His father's old Schwinn bicycle was his most treasured possession, even though the blue paint had faded to an almost gray color and the chrome handlebars were spotted with rust. That bike was literally falling apart, but to Tommy, it might as well have been made of gold. It was all he had left of his daddy. My husband Miguel had been killed in Afghanistan when Tommy was only 4 years old. One roadside bomb, and suddenly I was a 22-year-old widow with a toddler and no idea how to survive. Now, 4 years later, I was working double shifts at Murphy's Diner, just to keep our tiny 2-bedroom apartment. The rent was $800 a month, which might not sound like much, but when you're making $9 an hour, plus tips that barely covered gas money, every single dollar mattered. I remember the morning everything changed like it was yesterday. It was a Tuesday in October, and Tommy was getting ready for school. He stood in our narrow hallway, carefully adjusting his backpack straps and checking that his homework was tucked safely inside. The backpack was secondhand, bought from Goodwill for $3, but Tommy treated it like it was brand new. "Mom, do you think maybe for Christmas?" he started to ask, then stopped himself. He did this a lot lately, beginning to ask for things and then catching himself, like he suddenly remembered we couldn't afford them. "What is it, baby?" I asked, even though I was already running late for my morning shift. "Never mind," he said quietly, pushing his glasses up his nose. "It's not important." But I knew what he was going to ask. He wanted a new bike. He'd been wanting one for months, ever since school started and he saw what the other kids were riding. Brand new mountain bikes with multiple gears and shock absorbers. Bikes that probably cost more than I made in 2 months. Meanwhile, my son was riding his father's old Schwinn that squeaked so loudly you could hear him coming from 3 blocks away. "Tommy, you know I'm saving up," I told him, which was only partially true. I was trying to save, but every time I managed to put $20 or $30 aside, something would come up. The car would need repairs, or the electric bill would be higher than expected, or Tommy would need new shoes because he'd outgrown his old ones. He nodded and gave me that brave little smile that broke my heart every single time. "I know, Mom. Dad's bike is fine, it still works." And it did work, technically. The chain stayed on most of the time, and the brakes functioned well enough to keep him safe. But it looked like what it was: a 20-year-old bicycle that had seen better days. In a world where kids judged each other based on brands and appearances, Tommy's bike made him an easy target. I kissed him goodbye and watched from our apartment window as he carefully wheeled the bike down the stairs from our second-floor unit. Our building was one of those older complexes where the stairs were on the outside, and Tommy had learned to carry his bike up and down rather than risk damaging it further. He was so gentle with that old Schwinn, treating it like it was made of glass. I had to leave for work, but I kept thinking about him all morning. The breakfast rush at Murphy's was particularly brutal that day, with construction workers coming in for coffee and pancakes before their shifts. My feet were already aching by 9 in the morning, and I still had my evening shift to get through. But between taking orders and refilling coffee cups, my mind kept drifting to Tommy. I knew he was having trouble at school. He'd been coming home with scraped knees and torn shirts for weeks, always with some excuse about falling down or running into something. But I recognized the signs. I'd been bullied myself as a kid, back when my family was struggling and I wore the same 3 outfits to school every week. Kids can be cruel, especially when they sense weakness or difference. The worst part was that I felt completely powerless to help him. I'd called the school twice to speak with his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, but she'd assured me that she hadn't witnessed any bullying behavior. Boys will be boys, she'd said, which made my blood boil. But what could I do? I couldn't afford to put him in private school, and homeschooling wasn't an option when I was working 14-hour days just to pay rent. Meanwhile, across town, someone else was having a very different kind of morning. Jake Morrison, though everyone called him Diesel, was sitting astride his Harley-Davidson in the parking lot of Jefferson Elementary School. He wasn't there for any sinister reason. His route to the construction site where he worked just happened to take him past the school every morning around 8:15. Diesel was 43 years old, with gray streaking through his black beard and arms covered in tattoos that told the story of his life. Marine Corps insignia, his daughter's name in flowing script, and the patches of the Devil's Disciples motorcycle club he'd belonged to for over 15 years. To most people, he probably looked intimidating. 6 feet tall, leather jacket, riding a bike that sounded like controlled thunder. But if you looked closer, you'd see the gentleness in his dark eyes, the way he always helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, the fact that he'd been sending anonymous donations to the local children's hospital for 3 years running. Diesel understood what it was like to grow up different, to be the kid that others picked on. His own father had been killed in Vietnam when he was 7, and he'd spent most of his childhood as the poor kid wearing hand-me-downs and trying to stay invisible. That particular Tuesday morning, Diesel was running a few minutes early. He'd stopped at the red light across from Jefferson Elementary and was waiting for it to change when he noticed the commotion near the bike racks. At first, it just looked like a group of kids gathered around, maybe excited about something. But then he saw the smaller boy in the center, and his blood began to simmer. Tommy had arrived at school right on schedule and was chaining his father's bike to the rack when Marcus Sullivan and his 2 friends approached. Marcus was 10 years old, tall for his age, and the kind of kid who'd learned early that having expensive things meant he was better than others. His mountain bike was a top-of-the-line Trek that his parents had bought him for his birthday. $600 worth of gleaming metal and perfect paint. "Well, well, well," Marcus said loudly, making sure other kids could hear. "Look what Poverty Boy brought to school today." Tommy's hands froze on the bike chain. He could feel his face getting hot, the familiar burn of shame that had become too common lately. "It's just my bike," he said quietly, hoping Marcus would lose interest and walk away. But Marcus was just getting started. He walked around Tommy's bike like he was inspecting a piece of garbage. "Just your bike?" he repeated with fake amazement. "This isn't a bike, it's a piece of junk. Did you fish this thing out of the river?" Jake and Connor, Marcus's followers, laughed on cue. Other children began to gather, some genuinely curious about the commotion, others sensing the entertainment value of watching someone get picked on. Tommy's hands shook as he tried to secure the chain lock. "Look at those wheels," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "I bet this thing is older than my dad. And what's that smell? Did something die in the chain?" Tommy wanted to disappear. He wanted to tell Marcus that this bike had belonged to his father, that it was special and important and worth more than any brand new mountain bike could ever be. But the words stuck in his throat, and all he could do was stand there while Marcus continued his performance. That's when Marcus decided to escalate things. With a casual kick, he knocked Tommy's bike over, sending it clattering to the asphalt with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire schoolyard. The metal chain scraped against the concrete, and Tommy watched in horror as his father's bike hit the ground. Across the street, Diesel's hands tightened on his handlebars until his knuckles went white. He'd been watching the scene unfold for less than 2 minutes, but he'd seen enough to understand exactly what was happening. The familiar rage began building in his chest, not the wild, destructive kind of anger, but the cold, focused fury that came when he witnessed injustice against someone who couldn't fight back. 20 years ago, he had been that small boy. He'd been the one with the second-hand clothes and the beat-up bike, the one who came home with bruises and learned to lie about where they came from. He remembered the helpless feeling of being surrounded by kids who had everything while he had nothing. The shame that burned in your stomach and made you want to disappear. But now he was a grown man with the power to do something about it. Tommy knelt down to pick up his fallen bike, and Diesel could see the boy's shoulders shaking. Whether from anger or sadness or just pure frustration, it didn't matter. What mattered was that this child was suffering, and there were adults nearby, teachers, crossing guards, other parents, who were either not seeing it or not caring enough to intervene. The light turned green, but Diesel didn't move. Instead, he pulled his bike to the curb and cut the engine. He sat there for another minute, watching as Tommy carefully examined his father's bike for new damage, watching as the group of bullies laughed and walked away, watching as the other children dispersed without a single one offering to help. That's when Jake Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to be another adult who looked the other way. He wasn't going to let this kid face the same childhood that had nearly broken him. He was going to do something, even if he wasn't quite sure what that something would be yet. As Tommy finally got his bike secured and walked toward the school building with slumped shoulders and downcast eyes, Diesel started his engine again. But instead of continuing to the construction site, he made a U-turn and began following the school bus route backward, memorizing the turns and intersections. He was going to find out where Tommy Martinez lived, and then he was going to have a conversation with the boy's parents. Because sometimes, when the system fails to protect a child, it takes someone from outside that system to step in and make things right. And Jake Morrison had learned long ago that sometimes the most unlikely people make the best protectors. Chapter 2: Angels in Leather. I never imagined that a knock on my apartment door at 7:30 in the evening would completely change how I saw the world. But when I opened that door and found a massive, leather-clad biker standing in my hallway, I thought my worst nightmares were coming true, until he started talking about my son. That Tuesday had been one of the longest days of my life. When I got home from my morning shift at Murphy's Diner, Tommy was sitting at our kitchen table, staring at his homework, not actually doing it. His glasses were crooked and there was a fresh scrape on his elbow. "How was school today, baby?" I asked, though I could already see the answer on his face. "Fine," he said quietly, not looking up. "Just fine, Mom." But nothing seemed fine. His shoulders were hunched like he was trying to disappear, and when I offered him a snack, he just shook his head. Usually he'd chatter about his day, but today he was silent as stone. I had to leave for my evening shift at 5, dreading every second of it. Tommy was old enough to stay alone for a few hours, but I worried constantly. What if the bullies found out where we lived? The dinner rush at Murphy's was brutal that night. Construction workers, families grabbing quick meals, loud teenagers at table 6. My feet ached, my back was killing me, and every smile felt forced. But I needed those tips. Every dollar mattered when you were barely keeping your head above water. I got home around 7:15, exhausted. Tommy was in his room, lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His father's old Schwinn was propped in the corner, and I noticed he'd been trying to clean the rust off the handlebars with an old rag. "Tommy, dinner's ready," I called. "Not hungry," he mumbled. That's when I knew things were seriously wrong. Tommy was always hungry. If he wasn't eating, something was very wrong. I was in the kitchen trying to figure out how to help my son when I heard the knock. 3 firm raps on our apartment door. My heart jumped into my throat. We lived in a decent neighborhood, but people didn't make social calls after dark. I looked through the peephole, and my blood ran cold. A tall man with broad shoulders filled out a black leather jacket. Dark hair with gray streaks, thick beard, tattoos covering his arms. He was everything my mother had warned me about. My first thought was that this was connected to Miguel's death or Tommy's bullying. Neither thought made me want to open that door. "Mrs. Martinez?" The man's voice was deep but surprisingly gentle. "I know this looks strange, but I need to talk to you about your son Tommy. My name is Jake Morrison, and I witnessed something today that you should know about." He knew Tommy's name, he knew mine. This could be very good or very bad. "I'm going to show you my hands," he continued. "I'm not armed, and I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to help." Against every instinct, I opened the door, but kept the chain attached. Through the gap, I could see him clearly. He was intimidating, but there was something in his dark eyes that didn't match the leather and tattoos. Kindness, maybe. "Ma'am, I know how this must look," he said, stepping back. "Big, scary biker showing up after dark. But I'm here because I care about children who can't protect themselves." He removed his leather jacket, revealing a black t-shirt. The tattoos were extensive military insignia on his left arm, a little girl's name on his right. "I was at Jefferson Elementary this morning," he continued steadily. "I saw what those boys did to Tommy's bike. I saw how they treated him. Ma'am, I've got a daughter Tommy's age, and what I witnessed, that ain't right." Something in his voice, the way he said "ain't right" with such quiet conviction, made me believe he was telling the truth. I closed the door, unhooked the security chain, and opened it fully. Jake Morrison was even more imposing up close, but he sat down on our outdoor staircase, making himself less threatening. "Thank you for giving me a chance," he said. "How do you know my son?" I asked, wrapping my arms around myself. "I don't know him personally, but this morning, I was stopped at the light across from his school when I saw 3 older boys surrounding him at the bike racks. They made fun of his bicycle, called him names. Then one deliberately knocked his bike over." Jake's jaw tightened. "I watched your boy pick up that bike with shaking hands, and something inside me broke. I felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes." "You saw that happen?" "Yes, ma'am. I followed the school bus route home because I needed to find out where he lived. I needed to talk to his parents and see if this was regular or just bad luck that I witnessed it." The tears spilled over. "It's been going on for weeks," I admitted. "Maybe months. He comes home with scrapes and torn clothes. I've talked to the school, but nothing changes." Jake nodded grimly. "Schools don't always handle these situations right. Sometimes it takes outside intervention to protect a child." "Outside intervention?" I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. "What does that mean?" "Mrs. Martinez, can I ask you something? What happened to Tommy's father?" The question caught me off guard, but something about Jake's tone made me answer honestly. "He was killed in Afghanistan when Tommy was 4. That bike those boys were making fun of? It belonged to my husband." Jake's expression darkened, and I saw his hands clench into fists before he consciously relaxed them. I thought it might be something like that. The way Tommy was treating that bike, like it was precious, like it meant everything to him. "It's all he has left of his dad," I said quietly. "Ma'am, my father was killed in Vietnam when I was 7 years old. I know exactly what it's like to grow up different, to be the poor kid that everyone else picks on. I know what it's like to have something that connects you to your dad, and have other people treat it like garbage." I stared at him, seeing him in an entirely new light. "You were bullied too?" "Every day for 3 years, until I got big enough to fight back. But Tommy shouldn't have to wait that long, and he shouldn't fight alone." Jake stood up slowly. "Mrs. Martinez, I belong to a motorcycle club called the Devil's Disciples. I know what you're thinking. Criminals and troublemakers, right?" I nodded, embarrassed but honest. "We're not what people think. We're mechanics and construction workers, veterans and small business owners. Men who've chosen brotherhood over loneliness, who've learned that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up when you need them." He paused, looking into my eyes. And we believe in protecting children who can't protect themselves. What are you saying? I'm saying that tomorrow morning, if you'll give us permission, we'd like to make sure Tommy gets to school safely. We'd like to make sure those boys understand that he's not alone in this world, that there are people who care about what happens to him. I felt my heart racing. You want to? What? Intimidate some 10-year-old kids? Jake shook his head firmly. We don't intimidate children, ma'am. But we do make it clear to bullies that their behavior has consequences. Sometimes all it takes is knowing that someone is watching, someone who won't let them get away with cruelty. I thought about Tommy lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, too sad to eat dinner. I thought about him carefully cleaning the rust off his father's bike, trying to make something old and worn look worthy of respect. I thought about all the nights I'd gone to bed feeling helpless, knowing my son was suffering and not knowing how to make it stop. How many people are you talking about? I asked. Probably around 60, give or take. I know that sounds like a lot, but 60 motorcycles? I interrupted, my voice rising in pitch. Ma'am, I understand this is overwhelming, but sometimes it takes a show of force to make people understand that certain behaviors won't be tolerated. We're not going to hurt anyone. We're just going to make sure Tommy arrives at school knowing he has people in his corner. I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything he'd said. This stranger had seen my son being humiliated and cared enough to track down where we lived. He'd told me about his own trauma, his father's death, his experience with bullies. He was offering help that no one else had considered. If I say yes, I said finally, what happens next? Tomorrow morning, we escort Tommy to school. We make sure he arrives safely and that everyone sees he's not someone who can be picked on without consequences. And then we back off and see if that's enough to solve the problem. And if it's not enough? Jake's expression hardened slightly. Then we escalate appropriately. But ma'am, in my experience, most bullies are cowards. When they realize their victim has protection, they usually find someone else to bother. I looked through our screen door at Tommy's bedroom, where I could see him still lying motionless on his bed. My baby boy, who should be playing video games or building with Legos, instead was lying there defeated by the cruelty of other children. Okay, I said quietly. Yes? If you think it will help Tommy, then yes. Jake nodded and stood up, putting his leather jacket back on. Ma'am, I want you to know that you're making the right decision. Sometimes, when the system fails to protect a child, it takes people from outside that system to step in. As he walked toward the stairs, he turned back one more time. Mrs. Martinez, tomorrow morning is going to be loud, real loud. You might want to prepare Tommy for that. And you might want to have a camera ready, because this is going to be something he remembers for the rest of his life. After he left, I sat processing what had happened. Then I called Tommy into the living room and told him tomorrow would be different. Someone had seen what happened at school, and tomorrow he'd have very special escorts. What kind of escorts? He asked, pushing his glasses up his nose. The kind that ride motorcycles and believe that kids like you deserve to be protected. For the first time in weeks, I saw a spark of hope in my son's eyes. Meanwhile, across town, Jake Morrison was making a series of phone calls that would change everything. Brothers, he said into his phone as he sat in his garage next to his Harley, we've got a situation. Remember why we started this club? Remember what we promised about looking out for the innocent? One by one, he called the members of the Devil's Disciples. Tank, who owned an auto repair shop and had 3 kids of his own. Bear, a construction foreman who'd grown up in foster care. Razor, a military veteran who understood what it meant to lose a father in combat. Each man listened to the story of Tommy Martinez and his father's old bicycle, and each man gave the same response. I'll be there. By midnight, Jake had confirmations from 60 riders. 60 men who understood that sometimes Justice comes in the form of leather jackets and roaring engines, 60 fathers and brothers and protectors who remembered what it was like to be small and defenseless in a world that could be unimaginably cruel. As Jake finally went to bed that night, he thought about his own daughter sleeping safely in her room, protected by privilege and circumstance that Tommy Martinez didn't have. But tomorrow, Tommy would have something else, something that might be even more powerful than privilege. Tomorrow, Tommy would have an army. Chapter 3: Thunder and Redemption. I woke up that Wednesday morning to the sound of distant thunder, but the sky was perfectly clear. What I didn't know was that 60 men on motorcycles were already making their way through our quiet neighborhood, about to give my son the most unforgettable ride of his life. The night before, after Jake Morrison left our apartment, I'd barely slept. I kept thinking about what he'd promised, what it would mean for Tommy, and whether I'd made the right decision trusting a complete stranger with my child's safety. Tommy had gone to bed with more excitement than I'd seen in months, but I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities both wonderful and terrifying. At 6 in the morning, I was already up making coffee when I heard it. A low rumble in the distance, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. But when I looked out our kitchen window, the October sky was crystal clear, painted in soft shades of pink and gold as the sun began to rise. The rumbling grew louder. I walked to our living room window and peered through the blinds, and what I saw made my heart stop. Motorcycles. Dozens and dozens of them rolling down our street in perfect formation like some kind of military parade. Chrome gleamed in the early morning light, and leather-clad riders sat tall and proud on machines that looked like they belonged in a magazine. These weren't the rough, dangerous bikers I'd imagined from movies and television shows. As they got closer, I could see their faces clearly. Some were older men with gray beards and laugh lines around their eyes. Others looked like they could be construction workers heading to their day jobs or mechanics from the auto shop down the street. A few were younger, maybe in their 20s, but they all carried themselves with the same quiet dignity. They parked their bikes along both sides of our street with military precision, engines shutting off one by one until the neighborhood fell into an almost reverent silence. I counted them quickly: 50, 60, maybe more. Our entire block was lined with Harley-Davidsons, and neighbors were already emerging from their houses in bathrobes and slippers, phones in hand, trying to capture what was happening. Mrs. Chen, from next door, stepped out onto her porch, her mouth hanging open. The Morrison family across the street, no relation to Jake, just coincidence, had their teenage kids pressed against the windows, filming everything. Even cranky old Mr. Peterson, who usually yelled at kids for walking on his grass, was standing in his doorway looking impressed rather than annoyed. "Mom?" Tommy's sleepy voice came from behind me. "What's all that noise?" I turned to see my son padding into the living room in his pajamas, his hair sticking up at odd angles and his glasses crooked on his nose. When he looked out the window, his eyes went so wide I thought they might pop out of his head. "Holy cow," he whispered, pressing his face to the glass. "Are those all for me?" Before I could answer, there was a firm but gentle knock on our door. I knew it had to be Jake, but my hands were shaking as I opened it. He stood there in full leather gear, but this morning he wasn't alone. Behind him, 2 other men waited respectfully. One was a massive guy, with arms like tree trunks and a surprisingly gentle smile, and the other was smaller, but carried himself like a soldier. "Good morning, Mrs. Martinez," Jake said, his voice warm despite the early hour. "I'd like you to meet Tank and Bear, 2 of my brothers. Tank's got 3 kids of his own, and Bear here served 2 tours in Iraq." Tank stepped forward and tipped an imaginary hat. "Ma'am, it's an honor to help your boy today. Any son of a fallen soldier is family to us." Bear nodded solemnly. "We brought something for Tommy, if that's all right with you." He held out a small motorcycle helmet, sized perfectly for a child. It was glossy black, with silver flames painted on the sides, and it looked expensive, the kind of safety gear that costs more than I made in a week. "We can't have him riding without proper protection," Bear explained. "This helmet has all the latest safety features, and it's brand new. Consider it a gift." I felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes again. These men, these complete strangers, had thought of everything. They weren't just showing up to make a statement. They were treating my son like he mattered, like he was worth protecting. "Tommy," I called softly, "come meet some friends." My son appeared beside me, still in his pajamas but wide awake now. He looked up at the three large men with a mixture of awe and nervousness. Jake knelt down to Tommy's eye level, just like he had with me the night before. "Hey there, buddy. Ready for the coolest ride to school you've ever had?" Tommy nodded speechlessly, his eyes fixed on the helmet in Bear's hands. "This is yours to keep," Bear said, offering the helmet to Tommy. "Every rider needs proper gear, no matter how old he island." Tommy took the helmet with trembling hands, turning it over and examining every detail like it was made of precious metal. "It's the coolest thing I've ever seen," he whispered. "Why don't you go get dressed for school?" I suggested, "while I talk to these gentlemen for a minute." As Tommy disappeared into his room, clutching his new helmet, Jake's expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Martinez, I want you to understand what's going to happen this morning. We're going to escort Tommy to school, and it's going to be loud, real loud. The whole town is going to notice, and some people might have opinions about it." "What kind of opinions?" I asked. Tank spoke up. "Some folks don't understand what motorcycle clubs are really about. They might think we're troublemakers or criminals. But ma'am, every man out there on that street is a father, a grandfather, or someone who wishes he could be. We're mechanics and veterans, small business owners and construction workers. We pay our taxes, we volunteer in our communities, and we believe that children should be protected. Today isn't about intimidation," Bear added. "It's about showing Tommy that he's not alone in this world, that there are people who will stand up for him when he can't stand up for himself." I looked out at the street again, at the sea of leather and chrome, at men who had gotten up before dawn to help a child they'd never met. "Are you sure this will work? What if it makes things worse for him?" Jake shook his head firmly. "Ma'am, I've been dealing with bullies my whole life. The only thing they understand is strength, not violence. Strength. When those boys see Tommy arrive at school with 60 riders behind him, they'll understand that he's under protection, and word will spread fast that Tommy Martinez is not someone you mess with." Tommy emerged from his room fully dressed for school, his new helmet tucked under his arm like a prized trophy. He'd chosen his best shirt, a blue button-down that was only slightly too big for him, and had actually combed his hair. He looked more confident than I'd seen him in months. "You ready for this, son?" Jake asked. Tommy nodded eagerly. "Will I really get to ride on your motorcycle?" "You bet. You'll ride with me, and all these other riders will follow us to make sure you get to school safely." Jake stood up and looked at me. "Mrs. Martinez, would you like to follow in your car, or would you prefer to trust us with Tommy?" It was a moment of truth. Was I really going to let my 8-year-old son climb onto the back of a motorcycle with a man I'd met less than 24 hours ago? Was I going to trust the Devil's Disciples Motorcycle Club with the most precious thing in my world? I looked at Tommy's face, shining with excitement and hope, and I knew I had to take this leap of faith. "I'll follow in my car," I said. "But Jake, if anything happens to my son?" "Nothing will happen to him," Jake promised, his voice rock solid. "I give you my word as a father and a veteran. Tommy will arrive at school safely, and he'll go home tonight with his head held higher than it's been in months." 5 minutes later, I watched my son climb onto the back of Jake's massive Harley-Davidson, his new helmet secured carefully on his head. Jake had adjusted the bike so Tommy could reach the passenger foot pegs, and he'd explained exactly how to hold on and what to expect. "Remember, buddy," Jake said over his shoulder, This isn't just a ride to school. This is your statement to the world that you matter, that you're worth protecting, and that you're not afraid anymore. The procession that followed was unlike anything our little town had ever seen. Jake led the way with Tommy riding behind him, his small arms wrapped securely around Jake's waist. Behind them, 59 other motorcycles fell into perfect formation, 2 columns that stretched for 3 full blocks. I followed in my car, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and excitement. Traffic came to a complete stop as we passed. People pulled over to watch, their phones out, recording what would probably become the most talked about event in our town's history. I saw parents pointing and explaining to their children, teenagers looking envious, and older folks nodding with approval. When we turned onto Jefferson Elementary Street, the rumble of 60 motorcycles was so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the school building. Children who were walking to school stopped dead in their tracks. Parents dropping off their kids got out of their cars to stare. Even the crossing guard forgot to direct traffic, too amazed by the sight to do her job. The motorcycles parked in perfect formation in the school parking lot, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking of cooling engines. Then, Jake helped Tommy off the bike, and every rider dismounted simultaneously, creating a wall of leather and chrome around my son. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. While I'd been sleeping fitfully the night before, some of Jake's brothers had been busy. Tank and 2 other mechanics had taken Tommy's father's old Schwinn and worked on it all night long. Now, as we walked toward the bike rack, I saw what they'd done. Tommy's bicycle had been completely restored. The faded blue paint had been stripped and replaced with gleaming royal blue enamel that sparkled in the morning sunday. The rusted chrome handlebars had been polished until they looked like mirrors. New tires, new chain, new seat. Everything looked brand new, while still maintaining the classic lines of Miguel's old Schwinn. "Oh my God," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Tommy stood frozen, staring at his father's bicycle like he was seeing a miracle. Is that really mine?" Jake knelt beside him one more time. "It sure is, son. Your dad's bike, restored with love and respect by men who understand what it means to honor a fallen soldier." He placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Remember this, Tommy Martinez. It's not about the bike you ride or the clothes you wear. It's about the heart that beats inside your chest. It's about courage and kindness, and standing up for what's right. And anybody who tries to break that heart, anybody who tries to make you feel small or worthless, is going to answer to us." The schoolyard had filled with children and parents, all watching in stunned silence. I could see Marcus and his 2 friends standing near the building, their faces pale with shock and what looked like genuine fear. Other children were looking at Tommy with new eyes, not with pity or mockery, but with respect and curiosity. As the motorcycles roared to life and began to pull away, Tommy chained his restored bicycle to the rack with hands that barely shook at all. Children who had never spoken to him before approached with questions and compliments. Marcus and his friends kept their distance, suddenly very interested in looking anywhere but at Tommy. I watched my son walk toward the school building with his head held high, his shoulders back, his stride confident. For the first time in months, he looked like the brave, wonderful boy I knew he was underneath all that pain and fear. As the last motorcycle disappeared around the corner, I realized that Jake had been absolutely right. This wasn't about intimidation or violence. This was about community, about protection, about showing a child that he mattered enough for 60 strangers to get up before dawn and ride across town for him. Sometimes, when the world seems darkest and hope feels impossible, angels arrive, wearing leather jackets and riding thunder. They remind us that we're not alone, that someone is always watching out for the innocent, and that kindness can roar louder than any engine ever built. My son had found his protectors, and I had learned that sometimes the most unlikely people make the most powerful allies.